thank you for inviting me. When Caroline gave me an invitation to come and talk to her, I agreed instantly. And my agent said, they're at least paying your expenses, aren't they? I said, well, come on, it is the Green Party. Anyway, I would pay to do it. So this is going to be pure pleasure for me. Slightly uncomfortable for Caroline, because I have told her that I want to be a bit lighthearted because I don't want to be too gloomy. We've had a terrible week on the environmental news front, and I don't want to send everybody miserable off into Saturday night. When I said I wanted to do some things that were light and personal, she said that is absolutely terrifying. So I promise not to be too nasty. So, I mean, honestly, Caroline, I admire you so much. You are not really a person, you are a phenomenon. You know, to see you in the Commons there, handling over brief, whenever I've spoken to you, it seems like, yes, Roger, the question you're asking, I have been thinking about for the past 5 years, and here are all the numbers off the top of my head. You are just absolutely extraordinary and irreplaceable. I'm sorry to say you are irreplaceable, but the Green Party has been very lucky to have you. Anyway, let's start our chat, because one of the things I said I wanted to ask was, what was the most mischievous thing you have ever done? And I don't know if you remember when Theresa May was asked that, she said, oh, once I ran through a cornfield. Well, I'm hoping for something a little stronger, but I did say I would trade an anecdote with you. So I have done many terrible things, as my wife Anne, and great support is sitting in the front row, will tell you. I've done many awful things, but one which I think probably could have caused a heart attack was when I was in the Today programme at 6:30 in the morning. I was going to be interviewed on something for the programme, and there was a reporter in the office. I better not use her name, we'll call her Emma. She was on a kind of standby shift for any breaking news. Suddenly, Rod Liddell, the mad and brilliant editor of the Today programme, rushed out and said, right, Emma, obit on Rothermere, now. So she said, well, how do we know he's dead? He said, Dempster. And she said, well, I'm not doing an obit of someone on the say-so of Nigel Dempster. He said, do it or you're in sacked. So she set about doing it, and the obit went out. And then I rang the office Hunter number. She answered it. Rothermere here. I understand that I'm dead. She called me, well, I finished it, and in fact, I'm not dead. I'm standing in your editor's office. She called me every word that you can think of, and she found it so traumatic that when I reminded her of it a couple of years ago, she said it had never happened. So it's like one of those traumas which is so awful that you just sort of bury them deep. So anyway, that's my anecdote.
It's very nice.
What's your anecdote?
I don't think I have anything to match that. I mean, I think the only naughty things I do is, you know, cutting the wire at Molesworth Nuclear Centre.
No, but I think we can agree that's virtuous in terms of this meeting.
Well, I mean, I took some sweets out of Woolworth's Pick and Mix. And
is that
really
last
sorry.
week, or what's the sort of timing on that?
No, that's a good 50 years ago.
Okay.
And you'll notice it was a big chain. It wasn't a nice small local shop.
Yes.
And
so you were sort of striking a blow for the populace.
I thought so.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Oh, well, that's pretty good. That's not too bad. Right. Okay. I'm going to do a quick fire round now.
Okay.
What is your favourite colour? Be careful. This is a trick question.
Actually, purple is.
Oh, the answer is green.
I know, but actually, I like purple.
Okay. All right. Well, that's an easy one. What's your
Which is
favourite?
UKIP. That's not nice. So no. No.
Nigel would love it. What's your favourite animal?
My favourite animal. Can it be a bird? Does that count?
It's allowed.
Yeah, I love the swift. Do you know about? Well, you know about swifts, but swifts a single swift can fly 1,000,000 miles in its lifetime. It does everything on the wing. For the first 2 years, you know, it can mate and feed and sleep and do everything on the wing. And it's that big, and it can go off to Africa and then find its way back to the same swift box. I just think
And
that's
just
amazing.
its little chirping sound in the air just lifts your heart.
I love them.
What about cats and dogs?
A dog.
Dogs?
Dogs, Labradors.
Yeah, but they eat babies and crap on the pavement. And cats eat birds.
I know, and crap everywhere.
Should they be banned?
On balance, no.
No?
No.
Restricted?
No.
Neutered?
No.
No controversial headlines
No.
there. By the way, is there a journalist in the audience or not? No, we're going to get away with it by the look of it. What's your favourite pastime? I have no idea what you do when you're not working. You work 23 hours a day. What about the 1 hour that's left?
Walking, said dog.
Walking.
Walking, said dog. The dog,
Right.
Harry. Binge watching things like West Wing. I mean, I've done it about 4 times now with lots of gin. Yeah, those sorts of things.
Okay. Food. Favourite food?
Panna cotta.
Panna cotta.
There's nothing in the slightest bit healthy, but I just love that creamy panna cotta. It's,
Oh, it's vegetarian. It's not vegan.
Well, no, it's not
Oh,
vegan,
you were
is it?
vegetarian.
I'm a vegetarian, and
But not vegan.
not a vegan.
To
Yeah.
stretch too far.
I try, but I'm not
Because
obviously not very
is the
hard on the
Green
meat of my
Party-
panna
Is the
cotta.
Green Party officially vegetarian?
No, it has policies to suggest that we need to eat vastly less meat,
Yeah.
and promote plant-based diets and treat animals a hell of a lot better than we do.
Right.
But you don't have to be vegetarian to be. Can
Okay.
you imagine going through the door and
Okay, that was a
Yeah.
pretty good speed round. So more serious things now, but not too serious. We'll try and keep it light. So when were you first drawn into the environment? What attracted you, and how old were you?
It was a late starter. So in fact, what got me into the Green Party was Jonathan Porritt's book, Seeing Green, that I think he wrote in about 84, and I read it in 86. And the terrifying thing for people who might be looking back at that book now is that it's still as topical, kind of 40 years later, as it was then. But this amazing book put together all of the things I was concerned about. So the biggest thing at that time was I was very active in CND, and so in the early 80s, you know, the threat of nuclear annihilation seemed incredibly real, and so it brought together that, and it brought together the women's movement, and it brought together environmental concerns, and it put them all into one package and demonstrated the links between them, and even better, sort of set out a kind of political program that would address all of those and make the links, you know, in terms of the way we treat our environment is how we sometimes treat each other, and certainly in a patriarchy, how too often women are treated by men. And so it made all of those links that I'd kind of been aware of in my head, but not actually properly connected. And so it was a real light bulb moment. And I've told the story before about reading. I happened to be in Clapham when I read it, and I turned the book over when I finished it, and it said the Green Party office was in the Clapham High Road. So I marched up and down the Clapham High Road looking for a lovely big building with a plaque on the wall, and eventually found a kind of
hole
shoe
in the
cupboard.
wall.
Exactly, and joined up then.
I have a long history with Jonathan. I've actually been very pessimistic about the environment for a long time, because it seemed to me that the political difficulties were so great that it would be unlikely that they would be overcome. And whenever I was interviewing Jonathan in a situation like this, I'd say, "Are you optimistic?" And he'd say, "Yes, I'm optimistic." And he regularly said, "Yes, I'm optimistic." And then once there was a bit of a change. "Are you optimistic?" "Yes, I have to be optimistic." "That's not quite the same, Jonathan. It's not quite the same. Have to be optimistic. You know, we've really got to try hard to be optimistic." And these are sort of cascading downwards. It's really hard now to be optimistic. I am no longer optimistic. That was this year. He declared that he was no longer optimistic. So I guess we'll have to deal with it at some point. Maybe we'll leave the optimism question till later, because it's a bit of a horrible one. And so, I mean, what was your route into Parliament? How did you begin? You said CND, but other stuff?
Other stuff. So the reason I was in Clapham was because I was staying in a really mouldy bedsit there while I was doing some research at the British Library for my PhD on 16th century literary romance. So if anybody needs to know about 16th century literary romance, I'm your woman. And so we've just established I saw the book and I went and joined up at the Green Party. And then very shortly after that, they had a job going for a press officer. And they offered such a miserable amount of money that they had no applications, I suspect, except for me, trying to make the case that my PhD in 16th century literary romance was exactly what they needed to promote the Green Party more widely in the media. So I got the job with the party between 86, in fact, I started in 87, so it's between 87 and 89. And the great thing, as you'll remember, if you think back to 1987 and 1989, in 87, in the general election, the Green Party got 1.3%. In 89, in the European elections, they got 15%. Now, I cannot take full credit for that, but it was an extraordinary time to be doing green politics. And at that time, we had so much help from, journalists and others who really wanted us to succeed. It felt like we were a new thing, although obviously we've been around for a lot longer.
I mean, the media was very much on your side.
It really was. There was that newspaper called the Today. It was just called Today, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And a new tabloid that was launched around that time. And they came out for the Green Party in those European elections and advocated that people should vote Green. And it was the time, to be fair, also where the Liberals and the SDP were going through a very messy process, and so their vote totally collapsed. But it was a time when the environment was really high on the agenda, and it was shortly after that that Mrs. Thatcher made her big speech at the UN and so forth. And seabirds and so on were being washed up on the shores of the UK, covered in oil, and then people weren't quite sure what was going on. And so the environment was just a really big thing at that time.
Acid rain was big as well.
Acid rain was really big. And
resistant chemicals was big.
Yeah.
Is the audience familiar with Thatcher's speech? Put up your hand if you know what Caroline means by Thatcher's speech. Okay, well, look, a lot of people don't know. Just talk a little bit about that, because I think for me that has been possibly the best ever environment speech by certainly a leading minister. Yeah.
No, I was looking back at it just the other day, because just in parenthesis, because this is quite interesting. I don't think it's confidential, but anyway, Any Questions is about to celebrate its 75th anniversary, and they are doing it by looking through the footage of, can you have footage? Radio footage anyway, recordings of Any Questions over the past, perhaps not 75 years, but anyway, a lot of that time. And they're doing it on 3 subjects. One was the environment, one was immigration, and I can't remember the third one. And so I was invited to speak on the climate and environment one. So we were going, they had bits of recordings going right back to 67, I think was the earliest one they had. And they were tracking how people were talking about the environment and climate over those years. Anyway, that was the reason I was looking back at Mrs. Thatcher's speech from 1989 in the autumn, and she was speaking to the UN. And it was just, if you read it today, you'd be amazed. You'd think, my God, that's a politician who really gets it. And this was, 40 years ago. And she just really understood the scientific arguments that were pointing to the fact that the climate emergency was a real and present danger, and advocating global action to address it. Now, I'm not a Thatcherite, and there's nothing much else that she's done that I would applaud, but that was an extraordinary speech.
Yeah. I mean, one thing she did that I appreciated was, I was father of chapel. That's the union leader in a National Union of Journalists terms, and I went down to work in Fleet Street, and the unions were just unbelievably bad. I'd turn up to get my pay packet. The bloke behind would be getting one for Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, and the person behind them would be getting Scooby-Doo or something, as well as their own. And it was awful, and somebody had to do something about the unions. It went too far, but anyway, that's by the by. So what about the path into Parliament?
The path into Parliament. So I was working for the Green Party between 87 and 89, and then, quite rightly, if you wanted to be, on the executive of the Green Party, for example, you couldn't be an employee at the same time. So I was looking around for a job that I could do that would be interesting, that would then allow me to be more active in the party. So I worked for Oxfam first of all in their press office, and then in other bits of Oxfam for 10 years. And while I was in Oxfordshire, I stood for election to Oxfordshire County Council. And so I was the first Green elected to Oxfordshire County Council. And so I did that between 93
okay, just so pause. So how was that? Because that's a great thing to do.
It was bloody difficult. I mean, the average age on Oxfordshire County Council, without wishing to be ageist,
893, yeah.
about that, yes, and overwhelmingly male and Tory, and it was just really difficult. I had a 3-month-old baby at this point as well, which they didn't appreciate. And one of the points I remember most of all was being told that I was bringing the council into disrepute because the council meeting was running late. The baby needed feeding, and I was running out to get said child and bring it back into the chamber, which didn't go down well at all. It was hard, but then thankfully there was a by-election the following year, and the wonderful Sushila Dal from Oxford, who has been a councillor for many years, she stuck the course in a way that I didn't. She came and joined me then, so there were 2 of us on Oxfordshire County Council, and that was transformative. As anyone would know, if you've been a single councillor on a council, it's really tough, and just one extra person is just changes everything. It changes the fact that you can put motions down and someone will second it, which is quite a handy thing. But it also just means that something where, there were occasions when the vote would go 69 in favour and 1 against, and that's me each time, and you just think, well, actually, maybe they're right. Maybe I've just got this wrong. Whereas if there's 2 of you, you can make light of it. You can remind yourself that, of course, you're right and they're wrong. And it just feels much less lonely and hard work and so forth. So
it must have been demoralizing at times.
It was incredibly demoralizing at times, but I tell you something, because obviously, as I say, 69 in favour, 1 against, and one of the debates I really remember was about a special school, and they were trying to close down this special school. And although the party's policy is absolutely all mainstream schools should be able to have provision to cater for children with special needs, if parents want a special school, they should be allowed to have that. And so they were going to close the special school, and the parents were all furious. And I stood up in favour of the special school, and the vote went 69 in favour of closing it, 1 against. But then when I was talking to the parents afterwards, they said something that really stayed with me, which was that they said, of course we knew you weren't going to win that vote. Of course we knew you weren't, because they knew what the political makeup was of the council. But they said, just to hear our views being given proper legitimacy and time on the floor of council really mattered. And the fact that you listened to us and you took that voice into council mattered. And that really was a moment for me, because obviously, as Greens, we spend a lot of our times being in minorities. And sometimes you do feel, well, if we haven't managed to swing the vote, have we in some way failed? And on one level, yes, of course we have. But on another level, just that sense of people knowing that there's someone on their side and speaking up for them in those chambers, I think is so massively important. And sometimes I think we can not necessarily understand how important that is, because we're so fixated on the fact that we haven't swung the vote, that we haven't established the fact that actually hearing those voices, being heard on the floor of those chambers can in itself be a really important thing.
And how did you make the next step to Westminster?
So then in 1999, sorry, it's lucky we've got a while. In 1999,
I've got to spit it out somehow.
The great thing was in the European, so when we got 15% in the European elections of 1989, that was under first past the post, so it made bugger all difference, and we didn't get any seats in the European Parliament. So we made a big fuss about it, and another story is about how Jean Lambert became our representative, because the rest of the Greens in the European Parliament were so horrified that 15% hadn't been enough to get an MEP, that they kind of gave her an honorary position to be a kind of a presence within Brussels, and they paid her to do that, and it was great. But it didn't give us any seats. In 1999, the European institutions changed the rules to say that if you're going to have elections to this body, you bloody well have to do it under a fair voting system, otherwise you're not going to join. So it meant that the UK had to change its voting system in the European elections of 1999. So you'll remember they brought in a list system, PR, and that meant that we had the chance of winning seats in the European Parliament. So Jean Lambert won the seat in London, and I won the seat in the Southeast. So then there were 10 years in the European Parliament. And then...
Oh, tell us a bit about that. Don't want to skip over 10 years in a breath.
In a breath. Well, it was wonderful. I mean, what was wonderful about it was that you were joining a Green group in the European Parliament that was made up of anywhere between 40 or 50 or 60 colleagues who were not just in Green in parliaments in other European countries, they were actually in government in other European countries. And that was just so exciting, the sense that the Greens were just part of the conversation. We were part of the institutional furniture. We were there as of right. You know, nobody was kind of getting confused about whether we were Greenpeace or something else. You know, we were there, and at times we were the fourth largest party in the European Parliament, and we could get stuff done. And the style of politics I really liked, in the sense that it wasn't nearly so competitive. I often reflect on the word compromise, because compromise in British politics in Westminster is a very dirty word. If you've compromised, you've sold out. You know, you've sold out your principles and you're a waste of space. Whereas compromise in the European context was actually something that was much more of a noble endeavor, about trying to find enough common ground with other people, trying to find a solution that meant that everybody didn't, you know, everyone could go away not feeling that they'd been completely shafted.
And what did you achieve? I mean, if you had to pick one or two key achievements during that period.
The other wonderful thing was that as a member of in my case the Environment Committee, which is obviously a cross-party committee, anyone within that committee could become the draftsperson for a piece of legislation. So it was almost like being in government, in the sense that you could pilot a piece of legislation through the European Parliament. So one of the ones that I was able to pilot through the European Parliament was around illegal logging and trying to close the loopholes in the whole issue of whether or not illegally logged timber could be placed on the market. And it was a wonderful thing, because you get to be the equivalent of a British minister, you know, because that bit of dossier is yours. So you pilot it through the European Parliament, through the committee, and then through the main plenary. You are the one who then leads the discussions with the Council of Ministers and with the Commission. And then you are the one, hopefully, who at the end of the day then gets to get that piece of legislation voted on, and which we did. It wasn't as strong at the end as I would have liked it to be, but nonetheless, it was a massive improvement on what had gone before. So you really felt that you could get stuff done, you could get legislation done. And I think the difference between the European Parliament for me and Westminster was that the European Parliament was all about policy. You could get policy changed, but it wasn't about the politics, because the politics was all in Westminster. And frankly, we could have got, you know, any number of bits of legislation through the European Parliament, and no one would have given a toss in the UK, partly because they wouldn't have known. And we're going to have a debate in a moment about how abysmally the media covered what happened in Europe, with some honourable exceptions. But, you know, I don't think it's an accident that, you know, one of the reasons that we had Brexit was that most people still didn't know what the EU was doing, and what our own representatives were doing in the EU, and trying to educate people about that during a referendum campaign that was so biased from the start was awful.
I was at the World Social Summit in Sweden. We'd been there about 3 days, trying to solve problems like, you know, women's rights, education, health and stuff. And Boris Johnson turned up from Brussels as a junior correspondent in Brussels. And he arrived on day 3. He said, "Oh, what's all this about then? You know, what do we think these hotels are costing? Well, that must be 80 quid. How many delegates are there?" Multiplied it up and filed a story to the Telegraph saying, "Social summit to help the world's poor is costing X million pounds, while fat cats, you know, dine in 4-star hotels." I mean, God knows what sort of hotels we want our MPs or representatives to live in. But anyway, that's what it was. And the next day, or immediately, all of us hacks had a complaint from our news desk. "Why have you not offered us this story?" So that it was just too good to be true. And he went on, of course, to do the straight bananas and small condoms. And that was, I mean, the problem is it's very funny. That's the trouble with dealing with Boris. He can be very, very funny. Anyway,
the small condoms one.
There were two. The Italians were trying to push through a legislation to make condoms in a size that was not big enough for the British member. Talking about members, now Parliament.
So now Parliament, yes. So meanwhile,
She did ask me earlier on what mischief have you got up your sleeve, and I said, "Well, I don't know yet."
So while I have been beavering away in the European Parliament, in Brighton and Hove, people have been beavering away, and in particular, I want to pay tribute to Keith Taylor and to Pete West, who was the first councillor, and a number of others who had been beavering away, making the vote bigger and bigger in Brighton and Hove, such that when Keith Taylor stood in 2005, that was the biggest vote we'd ever had across the country. And we've got a really big councillor group here in Brighton. And so a number of people came and asked if I would consider standing in Brighton. And after a lot of heart examination and so forth, it was a really difficult time. But anyway, in the end, I did stand. And so then I was elected in 2010, and he then took my seat in what had been my seat, because he was the next on the list, on the European list. So he became the MEP and I became the MP.
And if you had to categorize any achievements in that time, I mean, it's been brilliant just seeing you come up as the alternative voice, you know, somebody who's often saying something completely different, like on HS2 and Labour in hock to the unions, Tories in hock to the construction industry. You've been consistently saying, no, this is the wrong solution. That sort of thing, you know, time and time again, you've done that. Is there anything that particularly stands out where you will go to your grave thinking, well, at least I did X? Put those sweeties back into Woolworth's jar.
I mean, you can imagine that quite a lot of people have asked, you know, what are you proud of? What have you achieved? And so forth. And it is a difficult question to answer in the sense that it's got a long answer. So I mean, one thing I'm proud of is to have increased the majority here, you know, three times. When I was first elected, it was 1,200. By the end, it was 20,000. And that is because I've had a wonderful team. I mean, I've been extraordinarily blessed with a fantastic staff team who's just worked so hard to make sure that my profile was high and that we get back to constituents really, really efficiently and effectively and so forth. So, but I think that's important that you know, people took a punt in 2010. They didn't know what a Green MP was going to be like. It was a big risk that they took, and I'm glad to have been able to repay that, I hope. And then there's stuff about kind of changing the subject at Westminster. And by that, I mean, you know, holding the first debate in Westminster about whether or not constant economic growth was a great thing from either actually social reasons or environmental reasons, and getting that on the agenda, or getting fracking on the agenda because it simply wasn't before. Or when I was first elected to Brighton, it was it had the reputation as the drugs death capital of Britain, and so getting a debate, the first debate on the regulation of drugs, and making the point that the Misuse of Drugs Act, dating back from 1971, simply was not working and was making life worse for people. So partly it was about putting stuff on the agenda that wouldn't otherwise have been there. Partly, I hope it was a bit about trying to do politics differently. And this goes back to just the horror that I experienced when you first go to Westminster and you see just the bonkersness of it all. You know, for example, the fact that it takes 20 minutes to vote for each vote, you know, because you're filing through the I lobby or the no lobby. And in the European Parliament, you know, 6 votes would take you a couple of minutes, you know, because it's all electronic voting. 6 votes in Westminster will take you a couple of hours because you're doing all the stupid going through the I lobby and the no lobby. And so, you know, trying to bring in, we had a debate about that. One of the things actually was around, one thing I did win was on explanatory statements. So when you put an amendment in the European Parliament, you have to say in a few sentences what that amendment is designed to achieve. In the Westminster Parliament, you could just put the amendment in, and so when you're looking at the amendment, it says something like, you know, in Schedule 6, paragraph 4, little c, say change yes to no or something. And so you have to go to so many other documents to find that out, what that really is about. And so I was suggesting that we would have explanatory statements in the British Parliament. And you'd have thought that I was suggesting, you know, that we kind of, I don't know, move Parliament to Newcastle or something. I mean, people were so horrified that MPs should know what they're voting on. This would seem to me totally ridiculous. And what was so interesting was it was the whips who were fighting back so hard to say that they didn't want these explanatory statements. And the reason was, and I'd literally seen this happen, that it was a great advantage for the whips, for their members not to know what the vote was on, because then they could just, you know, manipulate that vote and make sure that people did what they were told. And you'll know this, the convention is that once you've stepped into the I lobby or the no lobby, you have to progress through it and get counted out the other end. So once you've been pushed through when you've crossed the threshold, you can't reverse out again if you've changed your mind or you've thought, actually, I really don't want to vote this way. So then you had the bizarre thing of people hiding in the toilets. There were toilets in the two lobbies. So for a while, people used to hide in the toilets, so they didn't get counted out the other end, and so their vote wasn't recorded. So now the whips go through the I lobby and the no lobby, making sure no one's hiding in the toilets. I mean, it is just bonkers. Anyhow, so explanatory statements, they're not mandatory, but they are increasingly, the pressure is to do them. So that's a long way of just saying, trying to change some of the stupid conventions in the way that Parliament works. Concretely, one of the things I'm proud of is what I hope is going to happen, although I'm a bit worried now that Sunak has got this big A-level stuff going on, you know, changing the A-levels and T-levels into one big new qualification. But until that point, he had accepted, or it was under Boris Johnson, in fact, the idea of a GCSE in natural history. And I am passionate about that because it just feels to me that we've got a generation of young people growing up not necessarily knowing nature around them and feeling intimate and familiar with nature. And I'm really struck by that amazing quote from Richard Louv, who wrote the book Last Child in the Wood, where he says we won't protect what we don't love, and we won't love what we don't know, and we won't know what we don't feel and touch and smell and taste and hear. And so that's that sense about how do we get young people in nature again. And so this idea of a natural history GCSE, which was the idea of Mary Colwell, to whom I pay massive tribute. She's you might know her, in fact, she was a broadcaster from the Southwest and a writer and a naturalist. Anyhow, it was her idea, and when we worked on it together, and I pressed it in Parliament, and it was agreed, has been agreed, and so there is a curriculum being drawn up now. But the idea of it was that it would be a really hands-on GCSE, you know, so it would be people with microscopes and magnifying glasses and getting mud in their fingernails and getting out into nature. And if we can really make that happen, I think that could be really, really helpful.
Lovely. And regrets? I mean, regrets, I've had a few. I should think you've had a million. I mean, yeah, it's going to pot. But apart from that, you know, the good news is, what are your regrets? Anything specific? I mean, clearly there were things you just couldn't do anything about as one person.
I mean,
Parliament. What could you have done something about, but you didn't do?
I mean, it wasn't my failure alone, but I do wish we could have done more for the people's vote on Brexit. You know, I genuinely thought that we could win a people's vote to get that result looked at again and to give people the opportunity with a basis of a bit more information. And it was an extraordinary time, actually, the sort of the 6 months running up to the general election of 2019, because there were all these meetings going on that I'm amazed no one's written about, because I just kept thinking, surely someone like Anna Soubry or Dominic Grieve or Hilary Benn or somebody will write the story, because there were so many meetings, sometimes 3 or 4 a day in Hilary Benn's office. And we chose Hilary Benn's office because it was really remote. I kept never finding my way there anyway, but it was just so that people didn't see the fact that there was this cross-party group of MPs who were really working together to see how do we get this through Parliament. And if it hadn't been for Jo Swinson basically calling Boris Johnson's bluff and saying, bring on a general election. And he really wanted the general election in 2019. So he went for it. And that meant that Labour went for it too. If we'd managed to hold off that general election for longer, and I don't know if you remember all this, but, you know, Johnson was getting more and more frustrated and proroguing Parliament because it wouldn't do what he wanted. You know, if we could have just held off longer, I think we could have got the people's vote through. So I'm sorry that we didn't build more of a momentum behind that and get that.
Okay, last question here. So I have told my children what I want on my epitaph. My spelling is impeccable, even though I say so myself, except for one word, which is occasion. Terrifies me. I'm feeling slightly nervous just mentioning the word to you because I can't spell it ever. It terrifies me. So on my gravestone, if I have a gravestone, I want the words occasionally, spelt wrong, he made people think.
Oh, that's nice.
So that's fairly modest, unlike me. What's your epitaph for yourself?
God.
You better hurry up, otherwise I'll ask for shout outs in the audience.
Well, never believe you can't make a difference.
Yeah,
because I think that's
nice.
Something, you know, it's not to say that it's not to say that was all me, because that does sound immodest, but you know, that Margaret Mead quote, isn't it, that, you know, a small number of people can make a difference.
Yes.
And it was absolutely a team effort, everything that I have done. And there are plenty of things I haven't managed to do, but that sense, I just think it's so powerful for the right to tell us that we can't make a difference, that individuals can't make a difference. And so then people lose their sense of agency and power and so on. And it just feels so important to me that we keep on hold of that and make sure people know that they can make a difference, because that's the only way that things will change. So
Brilliant.
somehow something.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Lucas.